of corpus linguistics. I'm going to be talking about focusing on two main areas, which are language learning and teaching and discourse analysis, because although there are a lot of applications of corpus linguistics, to me these are the main ones and the way we can organize things. So I'm going to talk first about language learning and teaching. And this is really to do with what do we teach, how do we teach it, and then the theme of investigating learner language. So the corpus linguistics has had a big influence on the way that language is described. What do we teach? There have been corpus-driven dictionaries and grammars since the 1980s, and I think the big influence on language teaching has been the integration of vocabulary and grammar, lexis and grammar, people who see a focus on vocabulary and usage, but also seeing grammar as a kind of lexis. So not having one lesson on lexis, one lesson on grammar, but integrating the two together. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about the form-meaning connection through the idea of constructions, but we'll come on to that in a moment. So a corpus-driven dictionary. I had the privilege of working on what had been the first corpus-driven dictionary of English, although I didn't work on it until it came to the second edition, and this was the Cobil dictionary. And so to illustrate this, these are some of the meanings of the word fail, which are exemplified in the Cobil dictionary. And just to pick out some of those, so if you look at the bit in yellow at the top, here the definition says if you fail to do something, and we have the grammar of that notice with fail followed by a to infinitive, or fail followed by in. So the party failed to win, or he failed in his attempt. So that focus on grammar with the definition is something about the Cobil dictionary. And if we look at others of these entries, others of these definitions, they say that what they really talk about is the subject of the verb. So the little box in green tells us if a quality or ability fails you or it fails, it's not great enough. And so this is talking about the way that you use the grammar of fail you, or something fails. It's a kind of ergative verb. It has a transitive and intransitive use, and the subject is a quality or ability, so quite specific. And then down in red, towards the bottom of your screen, you've got if something such as your health is failing. And here we have the grammar of the ing form, the continuous form is failing. And the example is the health was failing rapidly. And then in blue on the right of the screen, you can see the phrases with fail. I fail to see, I fail to understand. That really is nothing to do with failure. It's to do with not agreeing. So I fail to see why it should be different now doesn't mean I am unable to see. It means I don't agree with you. And the grammar tells us that that phrase, fail to see, is followed by a WH clause. So all of this became possible because of the method of producing the dictionary with a corpus. Now, then we moved on to doing pattern grammar, using the patterns that have been identified in the dictionary. And it was the largest scale work of its kind simply because every single sense of every single word in the dictionary had the patterns identified. There are about 200 patterns, and they've all been collected and grouped by meaning, and this is now available as an online resource. Now, meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, the notion of construction grammar was coming into being from cognitive linguistics. And Goldberg has described this as a construction, as a learned matching of form and meaning. Really things that are very similar to patterns, but they had never heard of us and we had never heard of them until after we'd finished this work. But in a sense, as I say, the approach is quite similar, except that in construction grammar, you have examples of constructions, but no comprehensive listing of constructions. Now, I want to, at this point, make a slight digression, because this question came up yesterday, and somebody, a very astute questioner, raised the point that there are a lot of approaches to form and meaning. And I've just listed some of these here. So the local grammar that we spoke about yesterday, FrameNet, which is very influential, the work of Charles Fillmore and many, many, many other people. Perhaps lesser known, the Pattern Dictionary of English Verbs, which is available online. You search for PDEV, P-D-E-V, by Patrick Hanks. Valency grammar, Thomas Herbst and others that somebody mentioned yesterday, and in a different way, systemic functional grammar from Halliday. And in a sense, you can look at all of these and say, they're kind of doing the same thing, but they're doing it in a slightly different way. They're doing different terminology. Two of my colleagues are working on the notion of pattern and construction and FrameNet. But I'm working at the moment on pattern and construction, really only because of all of these, I think it's the best known. So if we take something like Amy told Brian that the bus was late, you'll see that a lot of these examples are about the bus being late. I think I'm a bit obsessed with buses at the moment. My bus this morning was on time, hence I am not late. So here we have a pattern, the verb, noun, that clause pattern. And we can describe this in a lot of different ways. We can say it's a subject and a predicate and an object clause. We can say that it's a person, verbs, person proposition, or a speaker, verbs, hearer, message, or a sayer, verbs, recipient, verbiage. There's an awful lot of language we can use to say that Amy is a particular kind of thing, tell is a particular verb, Brian is a particular kind of thing, and that clause contains a particular kind of information. So if you're going to try and systematize this, you've kind of got to make a choice between which of these terminologies you're going to use. You've then got other instances of VN, that, verb, noun, that clause, which do not start with, which don't have the same person told person that. So here the first example, the size of the blaze told firefighters that the fire had been started deliberately. Here we've got an event or a thing, tells some people information, but obviously the size of the blaze is not a speaker, it's not a person, and that the fire had been started deliberately is not something that somebody actually says. Ron flattered himself that his question was a good one is another instance. Ron does not say anything in this example. And then the thought struck her that she might have missed the bus. These are invented examples, you can tell, because they're all about buses. The thought struck her that I might have missed the bus is again a different thing. So if we transfer this into constructions, here's an attempt to do this. We've got 4 constructions here. A person tells a person that, a source tells a person tells themselves that, and the thought hits the person that. And then the first of these, we can actually distinguish between just telling or telling with positive affect, assure, console, guarantee, or tell with negative affect, caution, warn, forewarn, or cause somebody to think something, convince, or persuade. And so we can end up with actually 7 constructions, 4 of which are sort of grouped together. So Amy told Brian the bus would be late, Amy assured Brian, Amy warned Brian, Amy convinced Brian. Number 5, the long queue told Brian the bus was already late. Brian kidded himself the bus would be on time, and the thought struck Brian that the bus might be late. So how do we systematize these 7 constructions that all come from the same pattern? Well, here I draw, and this is quite recent stuff, as in sort of within the last 2 weeks, drawing on systemic functional grammar to say, let's look at the choices that are involved. Now, I don't think I've got this right yet, but I share it with you as a first draft. We've got a choice between communication with represented speech or reported speech and what I might call figurative communication. We've also got a choice with affect or without affect, and if it's with affect, it's positive or negative affect. I should say here, I'm not necessarily talking about affect in the appraisal sense of affect as opposed to judgment and appreciation. I just mean by affect here, there's something to do with emotion and evaluation going on. And then there's a choice between you change cognition, as with convince and persuade, or there is no necessary changed cognition. So it's the difference between somebody persuaded me and someone told me. And we can make this into a network of constructions. As I say, this I don't think I've got right yet, but you can see that at each of the endpoints in this network, you get one of those constructions. And part of the aim of this is very unapplied. It's simply to get a comprehensive set of constructions. But the other aim is to move towards other ways of representing this information for learners. So here's another example. This is a construction which I'm calling the person verbs person for action construction. And it's things like Brian praised Amy for her excellent work, Amy blamed Brian for the mistake, Amy rewarded Brian for his excellent work, Brian punished Amy for arriving late for work, Amy forgave Brian for arriving late for work. These are 2 people with a lot of interpersonal problems, I'd suggest. So what we're looking at is the words praise, blame, reward, and punish, and forgive. And this is one attempt to say, this is the construction. You've got a pattern here. You've got the most frequent or iconic verbs in this pattern. You've got other verbs that have been found in the same pattern. And then at the bottom, you've got praised for dedication. You've got some examples, punish them for protesting. And an idea would be that what the learner looks up is the notion of praise or blame, and this is one of the constructions that they're shown about. So it's trying to move on from the information that is in the dictionary through the information that is in the pattern grammar, bringing in the notion of construction, bringing in the notion of systemic choice, and ending up with something that might be of use to learners. Now looking on to from language learning, what do we learn, what do we teach, towards the how. And here I'm going to talk about just a few different things, including data-driven learning, reconsidering corpus resources, and mediating corpus resources for learner use. Now, there's a lot that could be said here, but I'm actually just going to suggest other things that other people have done and give you one example. So a former student of mine, Maggie Charles, has done a lot of work with learners of English for academic purposes, creating their own corpus and guiding them through searches of their own corpus. Particularly useful, she's found, with PhD students, because they have very specific needs. A PhD is a very specific piece of work. So teaching somebody the general vocabulary of this or that isn't so useful. And what people really need is a corpus of the things that they are reading. And she has found that the effort involved in building those corpora is actually considered worth it by the students, because they're able to get a lot of very specific information. Reconsidering what constitutes a corpus resource, there's some really nice work by Fanny Meunier on this, where there is some software that I'm not familiar with called Play Phrase Me. But it's lovely. There's a database of films, movies, and you type in a phrase and it plays you. So it might be something like, I failed to see what. And it'll search through the database of films and give you lots of clips of films where somebody says, I failed to see what. And you get the context in which people say that phrase. So it's obviously fictional language, because it's films, not real people, it's actors. But I think it's really nice because you do get those contexts. And also, of course, for learners who are more used to looking at films and things on their iPads than they are looking at concordance lines and things, it kind of adjusts the corpus way of doing things to what they expect. And then there are attempts to make corpus resources more easy for learners to use. And there are various resources available for learners, such as Skell, the Sketch Engine 1, or LexTutor, or a book by Karpenko Sechem called Academic Writing with Corpora that directs learners to corpus searches. But I'm going to show you one which is based on the Bohr corpus, which is a corpus of student writing in British universities. So all the examples, everything in this corpus comes from student essays, student submitted work. And the idea is that when a student is writing, so the student has written, the aim of this report was to do an accurate analysis of the situation. Now, if you're a teacher and you see this sentence, you might say, well, it's good. There's nothing grammatically wrong with it. But there seems to be something about it that's not really very natural in English. So the teacher directs the student to go to the quick links resource and click on the word analysis. Sorry, the analysis is a word that is there in the quick links resource because it's a very frequent word in academic English. And so the learner clicks on analysis and finds lots of examples that other students have written using the word analysis, and finds the verbs that are used that are not the verb do. So produce, perform, provide, conduct, carry out, undertake, and so on. And if they look a bit more closely, they'll find that when the subject of that is report or essay, the verb tends to be the verb provide. And so the student may say, a better word than do in this case would be provide. The same concordance lines, but this time looking at the adjective, and we find there isn't the adjective accurate. There are adjectives that are to do with the kind of analysis, scientific, structural, strategic, quantitative, etc. But also adjectives that really mean it's very good. So thorough, in-depth, comprehensive. So again, the student is supposed to think, instead of the word accurate, I might say thorough or in-depth or comprehensive. Now, there's a lot of work behind this, of course, because these are not random concordance lines. Somebody has gone through, looked at concordance lines for the word analysis and selected ones that they want there. But once it's done, the student can do this self-directed learning using the Quick Links resource. So not only does the learner make their sentence better, in the sense that their sentence is more like the sentence that other students have produced, but they're, in a sense, learning how to use a corpus resource to do their own study. Now I'm going to turn to the third topic, which is investigating learner language. And here I'm going to be talking about work done by previous students of mine, including one who is here today, at least one that is here today, and talk about the concept of overuse and underuse, and then a little bit about choosing corpora and a little bit about identifying diversity within learner corpora. Overuse and underuse is a very unfortunate, the two very unfortunate phrases that are very often used with learner corpora, particularly when learner corpora are compared with native speaker corpora. And the differences are described as overuse or underuse. So if the learners use something more than the native speakers, this is described as overuse. If they use it less than the native speakers, this is described as underuse. I think this is really problematic, partly because it assumes that in a difference, the learner is always wrong. And actually, sometimes it's the other way around. It also assumes that what the learners want to be like is native speakers, which in many contexts is not actually the case at all. And it does depend also what you think a native speaker is. So there are all sorts of problems here. I prefer the terms overrepresentation and underrepresentation because it talks about the corpus rather than the learner. But I think this is really problematic. Looking at identifying diversity, there's been a lot of work on comparing different levels and measuring progress. And I think this is actually much better, where you're comparing beginner learners with more advanced learners, because that's really the target for the beginner. There's been work that I'm not going to talk about so much as comparing learners from different countries. Interesting work on comparing tasks and the influence of the task on the learner performance, and also comparing individuals, because we do tend to take a learner corpus as being a single thing, but of course it's lumping together all sorts of different learners who are different individuals. So let's give a quick example of comparative use between a learner corpus and a native speaker corpus. And this is really nice work done by a former student, Abdulrahman Al-Habi. And he started by looking at signalling nouns as defined by Flower Dew. And one set of signalling nouns that he chose were the words reason, result, effect, and cause, because they're all to do with cause and effect. In the learner corpus, there were 36, these are normalized frequencies, so per whatever it was, I can't just remember how many it was normalized to, but there were 36 in the learner corpus, and in the native speaker corpus, there were 169 instances. So the native speaker are obviously using this a lot more than the learners. There's also greater diversity in the native speaker corpus, so they're using reason and result and effect and cause. The learners are using the word reason. Now, when you have something like this, I think it's always interesting to say, well, okay, we know now what the learners are not doing. And we know that if you're a teacher, you might want to teach this. This is a teaching point. But the question always is, what are the learners doing instead? So is it the case that the learners are not using the word reason as much because they're not talking about cause and effect as much? So another way you can talk about cause and effect is to use the word because. So he then looked at the word because in both corpora. It's about twice as frequent in the learner corpus as in the native speaker corpus. And actually, if you add these numbers together, the learners are actually talking about cause and effect, it would appear, rather more than the native speakers are. So it puts in context that low frequency, relatively low frequency of the word reason, and adds a bit of, adds further evidence to the argument that this should be a teaching point. That it would give the learners more variation in what they're writing about if they sometimes use words other than because. Now, this is where I'm going to go on to measuring progress, and this is where I'm going to use Chow Mun-Hwat's work. And I always, when I use this, and I do it quite often, I always have to add a little warning at the beginning that the things that I am going to say are not the things that Chow said in his thesis. And I sometimes think that he probably wouldn't like very much the things that I am going to say about this, because it's my interpretation of his work rather than his interpretation of his work, which is rather different. So one of the things that he did in his thesis was to look at the word that. And this was over a number of time periods, and I'm oversimplifying here. So it was roughly the same learners or the same kinds of learners over different time periods. If we look at simple frequency, time 1, when the learners started, that is not frequent. And over the times, it becomes more frequent until at time 4, it's the 11th most frequent word. So they're using that more. He then categorized the use of that as being phrasal or clausal. So that place, happy about that, were phrasal uses. The doctor that helped to save Maria, they were very happy that. These are clausal uses. And if we look at the different groups of learners and the learners in different times, what you see here basically is that the proportion of phrasal that goes down over time and the proportion of clausal that goes up. So I would interpret this not as the students getting better necessarily, because there's nothing wrong with the phrasal that. They're not moving from getting things wrong to getting things right. But what they're moving from is, what they're including in their writing is a more sophisticated use of that, the use of that in this clausal way. And this is demonstrated by the increasing lexical diversity. So if you look at the more beginning students or the earlier time period, the phrasal that in relative clauses, there are very few and there's very limited vocabulary. The verbs that are used are only say and promise, say that, promise that. If you look at the later time period, there's now a load of nouns followed by that, experience that, friends that, pond that, something that, story that, etc. There's loads more verbs, find, find out, hear, hope, know, notice, etc. And we now start to have that following the adjectives. So there's a big increase in diversity and what I would describe as, although I don't know that Chow would, I describe as a greater sophistication. He also points out that this isn't always a one-way street. It isn't always an increase in diversity. There is also a decrease in diversity. So here you've got some of the patterns that drop out of use as the learners go on. Well, I think I've embarrassed Chow enough now, so I'll move on to the next area that we're going to talk about. So we've talked about language learning and teaching. We've talked about what and how and learn a language. And I'm now going to talk about discourse analysis, and here dealing with three topics: reporting the news, looking at academic discourse, and then a quick roundup of some of the other uses. So I talked a little bit yesterday about using newspaper corpora as a source of data. This has been seen as very important because newspapers are ideological. They express opinion. They summarize in some ways the ideology of the people who read the newspaper, partly, of course, because they tend to be very influential in forming the worldview, what I'm calling ideology here, the worldview, how we see the world, how we see our own society, how we see other societies, are very much influenced by the newspapers we read, if we read newspapers. These days, probably not so much because people get their news from online sources rather than newspapers, but we'll go there in a moment. And so influence on ideology is very important. There's also an emphasis on what I'm calling here quantifying disadvantage, because one of the emphases in looking at newspaper discourse is how certain groups within society are represented. And it might be certain ages, the way that old people are presented or young people. It may be the way women are presented and men are presented. And it may be that different ethnic or religious or social groups are represented. And it is pointing out the social disadvantage of some of that representation. And what we get through corpus that we don't get through reading is we see the effect of the cumulative. So if you read one newspaper article that is a little bit critical of some people, that's only one article. But what we see with the corpus is how all those different examples add together and accumulate. Now I'm going to return to the example I gave yesterday from Baker et al., which is about the representation of Islam in the British press. And we saw yesterday how they moved from word frequency to collocation to concordance lines, and transforming the experience of reading lots of small articles into a general experience. And one of their main methods is that of classifying instances and then being able to quantify them. This is the same table I showed you yesterday, showing the different sets of collocates of Muslim men and Muslim women in the newspaper corpus, and the way that the authors have categorized those collocates. And one of the things that they look at in more detail is the set of collocates that I've put in red here, which are to do with wearing the veil, Muslim women wearing veils. And they looked at then, inspired by this group of collocates, they looked at concordance lines for the phrase, for the collocation of wear and veil. And they were then able to identify meanings, and they classified those concordance lines into attitudes towards wearing the veil in these newspapers. So they classified them into 4 groups. It's something women are forced to do. It's something women have the right to do. It's something women choose to do. And it's something women demand to do. And you can see that having the right to do something and choosing to do something represents women as being agents of their own actions. So we would call those the good things to say. Saying that women are forced to do something makes them into victims. Saying it's something that women demand to do makes the women sound a bit angry and antagonistic. And so we might call those the bad uses. And they were able then in the different newspapers to quantify the different uses of this collocation of wear the veil, and therefore the different ways that the women being talked about were represented, either in a good way with rights and choice, or in a bad way as being forced to do something or demanding to do something. And they had one of the interesting results was that the newspapers did not split in the way that you might expect. And actually newspapers that talked about this a lot tended to talk about all of these things a lot. And then other newspapers just didn't talk about it very much. So it was a rather different result to the one that you might expect if you're familiar with UK newspapers. I'm going to move on to another example now, which is more recent. And this is a very interesting study in many ways. It compares cultures. It compares China and Australia with authors from China and Australia. And the common ground is that it's talking about how the national day in each country is reported. So there is this commonality here. It also takes the concept of news values. Now, news values has been around for a very long time before Corpora. But what they do is they make it possible to identify news values automatically by identifying the lexis that goes along with those news values. So, for example, there is the news value of negativity. Now, what this says is that newspapers will choose to report things that are bad news. This is particularly true, I think, of British and Australian newspapers. And I have known that when I remember a group of students who came from Malaysia, as it happens, and when they arrived in Birmingham, they were horrified at how terrible a place Birmingham was, because they were reading the local newspaper, which only had in it crime and accidents and illness and everything negative. And we had to say, no, it's all right. It's just the way the newspapers are. They prioritize the news value of negativity. So anyway, these guys looked at the lexis of negativity, and they had things like distraught and condemn and terrible and conflict and damage and death and break promise and so on. So it's a very clever and nuanced and detailed way of lexicalizing these news values. And then the other important thing is that it's a multimodal analysis. So they didn't just look at the language, they also looked at the pictures, and that's interesting. Now I'm showing you a table here, and this is another table that needs a warning, because this is not their table. And the numbers here aren't really important, because I've made up the numbers reflecting the sorts of things that they say, but they do not say this. So don't take this table as being from their book or in very reliable. The blue lines are Australia, the orange lines are China, the Australian corpus, the Chinese corpus. And really what it's showing is that the news values are different in the different sets of the different corpora, the Australia corpus and the China corpus. So you can see that negativity is there in the Australia corpus. That's the news value of negativity. The news value of positivity is in both, but more in the China corpus. The news value of proximity, this is news that is close and relevant to us, is more prevalent in the China corpus, but also there in the Australia corpus. So they say something like that, but not in quite that way. And do quantify the news values, and they do it in the text and they do it in the pictures. And to briefly summarize what they say that the National Day in China is reported positively. It's a national celebration. The pictures, the photographs, are where the negativity comes in, because there's pictures of traffic jams and disruption and queues and lots of people having difficulty getting around and things like that. In the Australian corpus, the text is very mixed. It's by no means all positive. So they've got Australia Day, which is, I gather, the 26th of January. It is a source of controversy because Australia came about because of invasion and occupation by British people. And so you can describe it as Invasion Day as much as a national day. And so the negative side of this is there as well as the positive. But the pictures are not negative. The pictures are wholly positive, and they show a diverse nation, lots of different ethnic groups, lots of different heritages, backgrounds, cultural traditions, all being all one, all Australian. And that's a message that comes across from the pictures. So I think that contrast between the two countries, but also contrast between the text and the photographs, and the message that pictures can give a message that the text does not, is a really interesting part of their work. And I think just another comment on that, where I think this book in particular tells us how much more complex and sophisticated corpus research has done, because yes, it's counting words, but there's been an awful lot of work underpinning that to group those words into the news values and link the corpus work with pre-corpus work, as it were. I'm now going to turn to academic discourse, because I think because of the relevance to language teaching and so on, this has come up a lot. We have vocabulary lists that we talked about yesterday, multidimensional analysis. There are some targeted searches and disciplines from the bottom up. And I'm going to talk about some of these, but not in a huge amount of detail. So we saw yesterday that there are academic word lists. The original one was Averell Coxhead's academic word list that was very general. There are also, as we saw yesterday, numerous studies of word lists specific to disciplines, and we looked at those yesterday. Multidimensional analysis I'm going to talk about in a moment. But there are also a lot of work comparing disciplines by looking at specific things. So things like stance markers, Ken Hyland has done a lot of work in this, or nominalization, and Maggie Charles, who I mentioned earlier, has also done work on this. And then I'm going to say a little bit about comparing disciplines from the bottom up. That's going to be a bit difficult to see, but you will see it nonetheless. So this is work by Bethany Gray, relatively recent work, where she did multidimensional analysis in the way that Biber had done it, but she redid the dimensions. So what this does is it tags a corpus for loads and loads of different grammatical and lexical features, just about anything you can think of. So is something a pronoun? Is it a present tense? Is it a past tense? Is it a synthetic or an analytic negative? Is it a particular kind of noun? Is it a particular kind of verb? So loads and loads and hundreds of features the corpus is tagged with. And then the different parts of the corpus, the different disciplines, there is some complicated statistics that I don't fully understand is done on this to see which of these features reliably occur with one another and which differentiate between the different parts of the corpus, between the different subcorpora. So what are the features that differentiate between the disciplines, and how do those group together? And then how do you interpret those features? And this is Gray's, these are Gray's 4 dimensions that she has identified through doing that work. So these are the ways in which texts differ from each other. So the first dimension is from involvement to information. So you read across the top line of the table. I'm not representing this in the way that Gray represents it. Again, I'm doing a rather different interpretation of the way she represents things. But it's easier to show it on a screen if I do this. So she differentiates, or the corpus study makes her differentiate between texts which interact with the reader more, or texts which give impersonal information. Then there is a distinction between narration and procedure. So there are texts that tell a story and the texts that do not tell a story, but they recount what is done. So there's a kind of past tense, present tense sequence of events difference there. There's a human focus as opposed to non-human focus. So the text is about human beings, or it's about entities and events. And then she has a dimension which is an interesting one, which is what she calls plus or minus academies, which is whether there are typical features of academic style or fewer features of academic style. And then what she can do is to map each of the disciplines against each of those dimensions. And again, the way I'm representing this is not the way she represents it, and this is not as good as the way she represents it, but it's easier to put on the screen. And one thing you have to notice here, and a key part of her study, is that she doesn't just take disciplines, but she divides some of those disciplines into quantitative and qualitative. So if we look at the narration procedural dimension, we find that history and applied linguistics and political science are very near the narration end of the dimension. So history and applied linguistics and political science tell stories, but that's only true of the qualitative applied linguistics and the qualitative political science. So the kind of study that does not use numbers so much, the kind of study that tells a story. Then close to the narration end, but not as close, is philosophy. And then kind of in the middle of the narration to procedural is the quantitative applied linguistics and political science. And then at the procedural end and far away from the narration end is the biology and the physics. And that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? If we look at human focus to non-human focus, applied linguistics is very human. But again, the qualitative applied linguistics is more human than the quantitative applied linguistics. And quite surprisingly here, the history is way over on the non-human end. So it's more about events than about people in the way it's written. And then if we look at the bottom row of this table, the quantitative political science and applied linguistics has more of the academic features identified by Gray than the qualitative political science and applied linguistics. And perhaps surprisingly, biology and physics and philosophy and history are lower in those markers of academic language. Of course, how you interpret that depends on what those markers of academic language are taken to be. And going back to the top, the most involved, the discipline that most involves with the reader is philosophy, and that's a long distance away from the other disciplines. So this work, as I say, builds on work that's been done by others using multidimensional analysis and comparing disciplines. Where Gray takes this a step further is to say that she's not just going to compare disciplines, she's going to divide disciplines into quantitative, qualitative, and in fact she does it quantitative, qualitative, and theoretical. But I've oversimplified this here for today's talk. Now, what is behind all of this is the comparison. And I said yesterday that I was a little bit uncomfortable with the way that corpus linguistics always compares. And one of the reasons for that is that you have to start from the position that there is such a discipline as philosophy, and that you can identify it, and that it is completely separate from another discipline which can be called history. And history is easily dividable from another discipline which we could call political science, for example. And in a sense, this is an obvious thing to do because there are journals which describe themselves as journals of philosophy or journals of history or journals of political science. And there are university departments which are departments of philosophy, history, or political science, and so on. But a lot of the work on academic disciplines has pointed out that these are not self-contained islands. And people have said disciplines are more like oceans that flow into each other than like continents that are separate from each other. But the methodology of corpus linguistics almost forces us to see these disciplines as quite separate from one another. One piece of work that has tried to get past this is work by Phil Durrant. And this is it's probably quite difficult to see, and it's even more difficult to explain. But what Phil Durrant does is he takes the Bohr corpus, so again, the writing by all different students. Now, he can identify the discipline of each student, but he doesn't do that. What he does instead is to take each student as an individual, and he makes a very small corpus of all the essays that one student has written. So he ends up with hundreds of corpora. He then looks at the 4-word sequences in each of those corpora, and he compares the list of 4-word sequences in each corpus. So he's comparing hundreds or thousands of 4-word sequences across hundreds of mini corpora. And he then does these dots, as you can see. So it's a visualization of the result of how close together the different writers are. And he then overlays that with the colors that show the declared discipline of that particular student. So if we look at towards the bottom of this scatter graph and look at the yellow is medicine, but you can see that the yellow, so each of these yellow dots is one student who is studying medicine. And the dots are quite spread out. They tend to overlap with psychology and linguistics and health science. Whereas if you look at the red towards the left of the scatter graph, these are actually different humanities subjects. So what he's asking is, how different are the disciplines from one another? And you can see that in a sense, the disciplines are different, because you can see an engineering cluster and you can see an economics cluster and a law and a history and a philosophy cluster, but they're not completely different from each other. They don't occupy completely different spaces on the disciplinary map. And I really like this work as an attempt to say, let's get beyond saying, I already know what my subcorpora are, and I'm now going to compare them. Instead, it's saying, let's pretend we don't know what our subcorpora are, and we're comparing different individuals instead of different disciplines. I'm now going to just go quickly through a few other applications of corpus-assisted discourse analysis, which I think mostly are to do with health, legal settings, commercial settings, and an increasingly important area of social media. In health settings, we have work such as, if we look at specific health conditions, particularly those that tend to be stigmatized, such as the mental health condition schizophrenia, how are these talked about in the press? It goes back to the news discourse, but particularly focusing on the representation of people living with schizophrenia. A different study, because people who have specific conditions sometimes form online forums to compare notes, to share experiences, support each other. How do people experiencing those conditions talk about them? There's a book by Collins and Baker about to be published that does precisely this. And then again, using online forums, you can ask what health service users say about the service they're getting. In legal settings, there's a big area of work in forensic linguistics, ascribing authorship. This is spotting, did this person really write this note? Here is a confession of murder. Did this person really write it, or was it somebody else? There's an accusation of plagiarism. Is this plagiarism? All of those things ascribe authorship. Identifying how key people like judges talk when they're in court. And interestingly, I think comparing legal systems in different countries through the texts that are produced. We talked a little bit yesterday about sentiment analysis, and I said, well, it must work because people pay money to have it done. That was a bit cynical of me, but it is a common use of a kind of corpus work that common themes in feedback are identified, and positive and negative sentiment is identified for commercial use. And as I said, increasingly, really increasingly, social media, texting, all sorts of social media platforms. A colleague of mine is now starting to do work on TikTok, and really trying to devise methods of investigating social media, with some of the themes being identifying political styles where the social media is political, and the big task of identifying fake news. And I'm going to leave that there. Just looking at some emerging trends then, what we've seen is more and more applications to more kinds of texts. Inclusion of non-verbal media such as pictures and videos, a greater concern for the texts that make up a corpus, tending to look at the internal variation within a corpus rather than treating the corpus as a lump. And continuing, I think, to balance the quantitative, getting more and more sophisticated statistical measures with the qualitative, the clever use of interpretation. And that is all I have to say. And these are a few quick references, but I'm going to stop my screen share there. If anybody's still here, thank you for staying to the end.
Thank you very much, Susan. It's wonderful, as always. Any questions from the floor? Usually it takes about a couple of minutes before those questions are flooding in. That's it. Or you can just turn off your mic if I've got a question to ask. Yeah. Please feel free to do so.
Oh, hello, Professor Susan.
Hello.
Hi. Hi. I'm just a beginner, or even not yet beginner, of the corpus linguistics learners. I'm wondering, for this kind of research, how many samples do we need to form a corpus for us to use? For example, I'm going to to start a study on the college students speaking kind of things. So how many samples do we need to form such kind of corpora to validate our research? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, it's one of the most difficult questions that anybody is asked. I don't know if you know the expression, how long is a piece of string? But that's really the answer to that question. So to be serious, the answer is as much as possible. And it's particularly difficult to collect speech because it has to be transcribed. So the corpus that you're going to get is inevitably going to be actually relatively small. I would say that you probably need at least 30 speakers. If you can get 100 speakers, that's even better. If you can get 1,000 speakers, that's even better. But I would say you could start a study with 30 speakers. But I would say also, remember what I've said about comparatives. And although I've criticized comparison, I think the way, particularly if you're starting, the way to do it is to think about a comparison. So you might want to think about getting 20 speakers from one class and 20 speakers from another. So if you've got lower level students and higher level students, try and get roughly equal quantities of the two groups. And then you'll have a basis for comparison between them. And then just keep on adding to them, basically.
Got it. Thanks very much. Very useful advice. Thank you.
Also get a friend to help you with the transcription.
Sure. That's a big project. Thank you.
Yeah.
Right, we've got a question here in the chat box. So thank you so much for sharing your insights, Professor Hunston. May I ask if you think, where was it now? Oh, it's gone. The question is about, there could be a corpus tool, do you think, may I ask if you think there could be a corpus tool that most people, even secondary school students, could easily use to generate data from text or learn from text?
Yeah, I think there is a big need for a corpus. I mean, I think the corpus tool is less important because I think the corpus tools are actually fairly easy to use. So if you have any corpus investigation software, it is relatively easy to get a word list, a collocation list, and concordance lines. I think the problem for secondary school students, and I do share your view on this, is that most corpora that are available are not suitable for use by secondary school students. They're either too difficult, or they're not local enough, or they've got things in them you don't really want secondary school students to see. They've got rude words and inappropriate content and all sorts of stuff. And I think the difficulty here is copyright, because what would be really good would be to have a corpus of the textbooks that secondary school students use. Either, depending on where you are, either the textbooks in English that those students use all the time, or if they don't use textbooks in English, the textbooks from another country in English, so that the kind of language is more appropriate. And it can be novels that are written for teenage readers, for example, where there is some control over the content and the level of the language without it being too artificial. So it would be possible to build such a corpus if you could get the permission of the writers to release the copyright to allow you to do that. And that's the thing that is really difficult, because I have discussed this with a publisher to say, you publish books for secondary school students. Can we build a corpus of the books that you publish for secondary school students? And they say, well, we'd have to go to each individual author and ask their permission, and they'd have to sign forms, and they'd have to do this and that. And so it all sort of, doesn't happen. But I think, so I think that's the issue. Of course, if you build a corpus and don't tell anybody.
Thanks, Susan. That's one very quick question, I think, from Sichuan International Youth Studies University. Could you please recommend some books to a corpus novice?
I think there are loads of books called Corpus Linguistics or Applications of Corpus Linguistics, or even Corpora in Applied Linguistics, and they are all quite good at giving information. I think too, there are MOOCs and there are short courses that are available for novice corpus novice learners. So I haven't ever come across a bad one. So if you find a book with titles such as those, I'd say that any of them would be useful, actually.
Thank you. Here's one more question. Says here, thank you, Professor Susan Hunston. You mentioned that the comparison between language learners and native speakers on language use to see the over or underuse. Yes, that is what we usually do. However, some scholars argue that using native speakers' speech as standard is a discrimination in language. How do you think about this? Thank you.
I agree. And that's why I think using native speaker corpus is not a good thing. I think there are loads of things wrong with this. First of all, there is the whole notion of native speaker is problematic. There are a lot of people who are bilingual speakers from birth or bilingual speakers from the time they start to speak. Are they native speakers? There are lots of people who speak a home language until they go to school. I'm talking about within Britain now. A lot of people who speak a home language until they go to school, and then they speak English. By the time they get to 15, English is their best language, or as good as any. There's nothing wrong with their English. Are they native speakers or not? So there's a big question about what a native speaker is. And I agree that there's then the question of English does not belong to native speakers of English. Even if you assume there is such a thing as a native speaker of English, English does not belong to native speakers of English. It might have done at one time, it doesn't anymore. And there's a whole field of study, which you will know about, called English as a lingua franca, which is where English is used by groups of people, none of whom would describe English as their first language. English, that is English, and that should be a target variety as much as any other. And this is why I like to say, let's use the more advanced learners as the target for the beginner learners, and let's use the teacher's language as the target for the advanced learners. So, because effectively that's what it is. So I agree with you, and I think I think it is a problem in the study of learner language.
Thank you. So one more question here. Professor, I found you mentioned corpus assisted in your presentation. Would you mind explaining the difference between corpus assisted and corpus based?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'd say that if you're doing discourse analysis that's corpus based, you start with your corpus study and you move on from there. I think if you're doing corpus assisted, you're probably doing more of a mixture of methods and doing more things that are what you might call non-corpus analysis, non-corpus text analysis or non-corpus discourse analysis, and then using a corpus at the point at which it would be helpful. And so that kind of mixture of methods, I think, is what I would call corpus assisted.
Right.
I hope that.
I'm not sure who is asking the question, but I'm thanking you on your behalf or his behalf. Right, maybe one more. Yeah, I think there are many questions here. I think better if you think your question is urgent, I would encourage to turn on your mic and ask the question so that it's not.
Hi.
Yes.
We've got a question.
Dr. Chow.
Yes.
Hi, Dr. Chow. I have a question.
Yes.
Hello, Professor Susan Hunston. I'm very glad to see you. So I have a question about the low frequency constructions, because when I was doing my work on grammatical metaphor, I found one sentence pattern, its occurrence is very low, just about one occurrence per 10,000 words. So I'm wondering, what is the value of investigating this kind of low frequency constructions in Corpora?
Well, I think it depends what you're planning to do with the constructions. I think it's always worth noting that a construction exists, even if it is very low frequency, because it is still part of the language. If you're compiling a list of constructions that you think learners should learn, then obviously the low frequency one goes right to the bottom. But it also may be that the low frequency construction has a very specific use and is very important in the very few contexts in which it is used. So it's a bit the same question of what's the value of studying very low frequency words. Well, the value is that they tend to be the words that people need to look up in a dictionary because they don't know them. And they may have a very specific and very interesting use. But it all depends on what you're doing with this set of constructions once they've been identified.
Thank you. Thank you. I understand. Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, hello, Professor. Can I ask a question?
Sure, go ahead.
Yes, I just want to know about comparative or contrast study. We need to establish or to build two corpora, but if one is in Chinese, another is English, there may be some difference between the corpus size. For example, if in Chinese, the Chinese corpus is about 20,000 and the English corpus is 130,000 tokens. These two corpus, they are they collect the same time period data, but they have different tokens. How can we manage this situation? Based on my findings, basically there are two approaches. One is to reduce the tokens in English corpus. Another one is just to use the normalized frequency to balance the two corpus. So which one do you think is more reasonable? That's my question. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I would say normalizing is better because it gives you the advantage of the larger corpus, but you can still compare the two. But of course, comparing two corpora that are written in different languages is a particular task that I haven't spoken at all about. But I would recommend the book by Capel, Huan and Bednarek that I spoke about the Chinese and Australia National Days, because they do talk about corpora written in corpora of different languages. And essentially, I mean, I showed you a diagram and I said it's really important that this is not the diagram that comes from them, because in fact what they can't do is to compare frequency across the two corpora, because the two corpora are in the different languages. So the two studies are carried out independently of one another and then compared, rather than comparing the corpora directly, because there are additional challenges to that. But to answer your straightforward question, I would say normalization is the way to go.
Yes, I see. Thank you.
Right, any final question? I think we are running out of time soon. Any final question from anyone? Just turn on your mic, please. I think there are lots of questions in the chat box, unfortunately, I think. Yeah, we're running out of time a bit. Anyone? Maybe one last question? No more? You're too shy to speak? Right. If you are, I'm passing on the floor to Professor Su Hang. Yes, please, Su Hang.
Okay, Joe, can you hear me?
Yes, very clear.
Okay, good. Before I say something about Susan's talk, I would also like to ask one final question, because I tried to ask the question before it seems there's something wrong with my internet. So my question is, so we have been doing some work on pattern grammar or collecting pattern grammar and construction grammar, and I like your proposal to use grammar patterns to identify constructions. So I'm just wondering how, in practice we can do that, or in other words, could you say a little more about how to identify constructions by analyzing or taking grammar pattern as a starting point? I think it's a bit maybe some kind of general questions. Yeah, thank you, Susan.
Yeah, thanks, Su Hang. This is a project I'm working on at the moment, and I've just started it. So I am literally going with the pattern grammar book, which is now falling apart. I'm going through each pattern and I'm looking at each of the meaning groups, and I'm just through intuition working out the constructions. So they're not, in a sense, they're not, so that I showed you an example, that example I gave you of verb, noun, that is an example that I've done. So those are the constructions that I have identified for that pattern. And I am coding them with things like who the participants are, the type of participant, and I'm also allocating them to a semantic field. So something like communication, cognitive change, so that can form an index. So the idea is to build a database of probably about 1,000 constructions. And it's not difficult to do, it just takes a bit of effort. But it takes quite a long time to do it. So I can share with you the things that I've done if you would like to, Hang. But I should say that, of course, construction, I mean, cognitive linguists would go mad at this point, because they say you don't know that a construction is a construction unless you know that it's inside people's heads. As you know, I don't do things that are inside people's heads. So what I'm proposing, so these are proposed constructions based on my reinterpretation of the pattern grammar work in the light of constructions, and not they're proposed constructions rather than actual constructions. But I would say also the other important thing to say is that you do end up with a hierarchy. It's not a list, it's a hierarchy, because I can share this information with you more easily privately, I think, rather than taking up everybody's time. But I can show you what I've been doing.
Yes, thank you so much, Susan. I think this is because I've also been doing some research in this area, so I would like to know what you have been working on. So I guess we just will send you an email and say what you were you have been working on. Okay. As Charles said, we are quite running out of time. It's already like 1 hour and a half, 1.5 hours. So I think it should be the end of the talk. Before we come to the end, I would like to thank Susan again and to thank Chao for helping schedule the meeting on Zoom, because I can't do that. So thanks to Chao, because Chao said I helped him a lot. Actually, he helped me quite a lot. So it's kind of like a mutual support between Chao and I. And for
a
Susan,
celebration of love. Thank you.
So another kind of connection is, as Chao also said, we were also supervised by when we also supervised by Susan. So it's kind of this in Chinese we say 师兄. It's kind of like a brothership. Yeah, thanks so much, Chao, for all the help, and thanks to Susan for accepting our invitation. So I think it should be the end of the talk, and we will be in touch again probably by email. And it's been very nice to seeing you again online. I hope for the Corpus Linguistics Conference the coming year, we may be able to travel to England and to join the Corpus Linguistics Conference in, I guess it's in Lancaster, so we hope we could do that. To anyone else, do you want to say something? And I think Professor Wei is still in the audience, so just wondering, would Professor Wei want to say anything more? And
I'm sorry. My camera does not work properly. Anyway, thank you, Susan. It's such an interesting talk that everybody enjoy hearing you. And I'm looking forward to seeing you in Beijing, hopefully very soon. Thank you very much. Thank everybody here.
And Professor Zhou Yanli.
Thanks, Susan. This is really reminding me of those supervision sessions, and it's always nice to hear you, and it's always nice to listen to your talks. And hopefully we can see each other in person soon, either in China or in the UK. Okay, thank you so much for the talks.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay, any final words? Chao?
No, I'm more than satisfied to have been here.
Okay,
Thank you so much.
Well, then let's just go to the end of the talk. Thank you so much, Susan. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Any photo session?
Bye, everyone.
No?
Bye.
Professor Zhou Yanli, do you want to take a photo of everybody here before we end the session?
Yeah, sure. Why not?
Thank you so much. Right, maybe we will turn on the video as evidence of you having attended this most meaningful event.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay. So anyone still online, could you, if you want to, you could turn on your camera so that we can take a picture together. Right. Okay, so I'm still waiting until my screen is full of the faces. Okay, so thank you so much. I'm still waiting, so there's more people coming. Okay, so we have more people. Like I have 2 pages of people. So okay, I see many faces and right. Okay. Okay, thank you so much. We're done. Thank you,
Susan.
Thanks,
thank you,
everyone.
Susan. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chao.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See
Thank
you.
you. Bye-bye.
See you again.
See you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye.